Hello, welcome back to Kairos. We are here today with Pastor Tom Pietsch to remember Cyprian. So if you want to learn more about who Cyprian was and why he's important for Christians today, stay tuned. This is what's coming up. Tom, great to have you back on Kairos.
Always a pleasure, Josh.
St Cyprian. Perhaps you've heard this name, perhaps not. Tom, who was Cyprian?
So he was St Cyprian of Carthage.
Where's Carthage?
Good question. It's in North Africa. It was a centre of the Roman Empire. They spoke Latin there, so it's right at the top of North Africa.
Modern day
Mediterranean. It is something like Tunisia or something like this now. The Christianity in North Africa was huge. It all went with first barbarian invasions and then Arabic invasions in the sort of 6th, 7th centuries, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. So what was a huge bastion and centre of Christianity was wiped out. It's one of the great tragic stories of Christian civilization in some ways. We're going back earlier than that though. It's the year 250 and Cyprian becomes the bishop of Carthage. What's unusual, he'd only been a Christian for a few years. He'd been a lawyer, sort of a barrister, you could even say, and he comes to the faith. He's baptised. He speaks about it very beautifully, about what the waters of baptism did, almost opening his eyes to what before he couldn't see. He becomes bishop. There's a bit of consternation about his election. He's sort of considered to be a bit of a Johnny-come-lately. He hadn't been a Christian.
I understand that, yeah.
Hadn't been a Christian for more than, I think, 5 years. And so he becomes Christian, then deacon, then priest, then bishop in pretty quick succession. Interestingly, the poor loved him. It was a common thing that if you were wealthy and you converted, you would make a large donation to the poor. We forget the monetary side of the Christian faith sometimes, but this was just a normal practice. When you're a wealthy Christian, you become a Christian, you give a large amount of money to the poor. So he had a strong support base in the poor who loved him.
And so he has this very quick succession to become Bishop of Carthage in North Africa. We're talking around the year 250, did you say?
That's right.
Okay, and what sort of bishop does he become? What does his career, so to speak, look like?
Well, one of his great contributions to the theology of the church was a love for the church. He writes treatises on the unity of the church. We get phrases from him like, if you have God as your father, you need to have the church as your mother. He also said outside of the church of Christ, there is no salvation. He really emphasises the church as the place in which Christ's presence comes and the place in which Christ is active, saving souls, saving people. And he wrote a book called On the Unity of the Church. It's interesting for us Lutherans, actually, because he spends a lot of time on the primacy of the Pope, or spends some time on the primacy of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. Later on in his career, he actually had a falling out with the Bishop of Rome, edited his book to take out some of those passages. So what was a big deal for him in theory became questionable in practice when someone who was sitting in the Bishop of Rome's seat was teaching something he thought was error. And so one of his big contributions, though, is the theology of the church. It's his life that perhaps gives the greater dramatic importance for us and is a good cause for us to be inspired by the grace that he received. He had a quick succession to becoming a bishop. It was only a few years later, a couple of years, that a huge persecution of the church was unleashed. This was the time when Christianity was not approved of necessarily or supported in the Roman Empire, and there was a Decian persecution. And one of the features of this persecution was to target the leaders. You can't kill every Christian, you go for the bishops, you cut them off at the head. Cyprian went into hiding. He goes into hiding, probably in a monastery somewhere or in the desert in North Africa, writes letters to the church, but he is criticised for not being there, criticised for not doing what he should do.
Criticised by
a lot of other Christians in North Africa. North African Christianity was often very fierce in a sense, very strongly felt, very passionate. And he was criticised for abandoning his post. Your job as a bishop is to be here, even if it means to die. He said, I need to stay alive to keep everyone together. In some sense, that was true. What happened was a number of Christians renounced the faith before the Roman soldiers so they could save their lives. And as soon as the persecution ended, there was this pressing issue. What do we do with these people who are now coming back to our churches?
Yeah.
And opinion was divided. Do we just say, come back, you're all forgiven? Or do we say, you can never come back here again? We might think that's unfeeling, but imagine your sister had died because this Christian gave up her name to the authorities.
Yeah.
She stood up for the faith. And this coward, didn't. Feeling runs high. Cyprian, runs this middle ground where he allows for people to enter back into the church, but after a period of penance. And so he really works hard to try and mitigate these two competing factions among the other priests and Christians in North Africa to allow people to come back into the church, but that they need to do penance for there's some church discipline. We use that kind of language for the sins that they'd committed.
So, and what did those penances look like for those people in those days? Do you know much about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of different varieties. They would often be able to come to church, but there would be a special section that they would sit in near the back. Churches often had almost hierarchical places of where you can sit and according to what your status was. So just as if you were just inquiring about the faith, you would often be dismissed before communion, you would be given a blessing. So too, if you were doing penance for some reason, you couldn't receive communion. And the church actually, so that they could be impartial, there are categories which apply to everyone. It's just equitable. So if you commit adultery, here you have maybe 3 years where you can't receive the sacrament. Although if you're dying, you can. And there are other sins as well, especially murder, and then denouncing the faith. These are sort of the big three: adultery, murder, and renouncing the faith. That they'll have set penalties for, and according to even the degrees that you did it. So it can be there's no communion for you, but there is the proclamation of the word and the forgiveness of sins with this penitential dimension to it too.
And so Cyprian lived through a very unique time, and the circumstances of his life contributed to his what were his major contributions to the life of the church, by the sounds of it, coming out of persecution and working with the church as to how people can be received again and what's appropriate discipline.
Yeah. There's a nice coda, by the way, to all this. So the Decian persecution comes. He'd only been a bishop a couple of years. The poor guy, this is hard. He goes into hiding, comes back, sorts it all out, cops all the flack for having run. It's only a few years later that another persecution comes, the Valerian persecution. He doesn't run. He stays there. He owns up to everything. He's under house arrest for a year. He's finally sentenced. They charge him for being a Christian. He's sentenced to death. And the only thing he says is, Deo gratias, thanks be to God. You can imagine if you are sentenced in a court to something that is unjust, to say thanks be to God. It's almost a sense of relief. He missed out on dying the first time. He's grateful to almost receive the martyr's crown here. And there's this very poignant account of his death where he walks out of the city. He takes his own clothes off. He puts a blindfold on himself. He stretches his neck out before the sword himself and is beheaded. And the whole community go with him and even rejoice almost in this death. And he becomes a massive figure. It's hard to underestimate what a huge figure he was for the North African church.
Well, Tom, thanks again for being here today to talk with us about St Cyprian and his massive influence on the church and the ways in which we as Christians today can be encouraged by his example and the grace he received. This is Kairos. God bless you.